Good evening. I'm Bob Hebert, Fort Bend County Judge, and I have some important information that I want to disseminate with folks out there that have been putting up with this. Before I get into the announcements, I want to thank some people. I'm not going to try and list them all because I know I'd leave somebody out, but we'll get around to thanking them in an appropriate way later. I want to thank all the emergency responders in this county, in our cities, in other counties in Texas, and other states in the United States that have come in here to help us serve those that have been threatened. You've been outstanding. I want to thank my cities, my school districts, and all our special districts throughout the county that have worked diligently as a team. We all know what our priorities are and who we serve directly, and we take care of those, but then we get together to coordinate our activities so that we smoothly serve everybody in the best way possible, or at least in the best way that we can generate. Your service to all of you is deeply appreciated. Our focus today remains rescuing those who need immediate assistance and seeing to their safety. The river continues to rise, although at a very slow rate, but it's still coming up. We're in new territory and have been since it went through 54.6, and we're now headed to 55.7, they tell us. We may not make it, but every inch we add is an inch we've never seen before in Fort Bend County. We're seeing streets, folks are finding water on streets that they had never seen before. And that is where the danger lies. We don't know where the water is out there because in people trying to move around, you can find yourself in some high water very, very quickly. So be careful out there. I know that evacuations are very painful. They're very, very discomforting. We've had several mandatory evacuations, and I will bring you up to date on adjustments to those evacuation orders shortly. But just today, water began entering the River's Edge community in Richmond and in the Cinco Ranch area in Katy although that water is receding fairly smoothly now that the gates are open at the Barker Reservoir. The river around Richmond continues to rise, and the threat to our southern communities is only growing. We'll have to wait and see what our final rainfall is, but we're quite confident that most areas in Fort Bend County took in excess of 30 inches, and some took close to 40. So it was an extremely intensive rain event, as well as a flood, as well as a tropical storm event. And for the record, this is our fourth FEMA disaster in 3 years in Fort Bend County. We've had the 2015 Memorial Day flood. We've had the 2016 Tax Day flood. We've had the 2016 Memorial Day flood. And now we have 2017 Harvey. So the folks in Fort Bend County know what it is to be in these kind of long-term weather disasters. We need to remain diligent. One of the things that lulls you into doing things that you might not do as the sun comes out. The rain stops. It's a beautiful day. But we still have a big river that's higher than it's ever been. And even though it will start down relatively slowly, and we will continue in a guarded situation for several days to come. My hope is that we don't see a lot of water coming down the river above Fort Bend County. So my hope is once we get this huge swell of water through the county, we can accelerate that decline in the river and get back inside the banks in the short term. But we'll have to wait and see what occurs. The current elevation on the river is 55.14 at the Richmond gauge. 55.7, as I said, is what's forecast. In the San Bernard River, we have another river in major flood. It's currently at a record elevation, 43.58. It's forecast to crest later on, and tomorrow drop down to 42.4 and continue its decline, pending, obviously, another rain event that might drive it, but we don't see that at least in the 5-day forecast. Barker Reservoir is currently at 100.93, has fallen 1/2 a foot since crest yesterday morning at the dam. That elevation is felt throughout the back of the reservoir, so we have numerous homes that have water in them, and that water is slowly declining as the level. It will decline at the rate at which the level at the dam falls. Today we processed 260 resource requests in our logistics area. We made 165 rescues today, and that brought the total up to 10,648 rescues since this event began Friday. We opened 29 shelters in Fort Bend County. 16 of those shelters have now closed. We have 13 shelters open. We peaked at 4,800 in our shelters. Currently, the 13 that are open are housing 655. We're slowly transferring long-term victims that are in need of longer-term shelter into Houston to their large capacity shelters there. Primarily because many of our shelters are in schools, and we want to get back to normal as quickly as the weather will allow us. So by clearing out those schools and get those folks into fixed long-term shelters, we can return those school facilities back to the educators and let them prepare to open school. I think we had 1 or 2 school districts in Fort Bend County that may have gotten 1 day in the school year before they closed down for this event. We think the kids need to get back in school as quickly as possible. When it comes to recovery, we're starting recovery now. We have moved in our debris contractor, and they will be out in areas as soon as water allows. We have received a FEMA disaster number for the county. That means individuals who have suffered financial loss as a result of this flood may go ahead and apply for individual assistance and public assistance through the website disasterassistance.gov. That's disasterassistance.gov, or by calling the number 1-800-621-3362. We've already triggered all the qualifying actions that we had to take, and they should be able to initiate processing their paperwork. I hope it gives them a good feeling to know that at least they can start and initiate their attempt at recovery. We have nonprofits meeting daily with officials from OEM, planning additional steps to accelerate that recovery. Unfortunately, we're pretty good at that. This is our 4th flood event, like I say, in 3 years. So we've been down there before. We'll open everything up in a regular process from here on out. However, I want to caution everybody, we are dealing with a federal agency. There's paperwork, tons of it. There's time lapses in the process. Recovery is a long term, unless you have insurance that covers your loss and you handle it in the insurance market. If you have to depend on federal resources for recovery, anticipate that it will take a matter of months, not a matter of weeks, and may extend out. We have some folks that are still in the recovery program from our 2016 tax day flood, which is well over a year ago. Okay, and unfortunately, those properties were hit again by this flood. So we'll see. The I want to urge everybody that if you need any information on what I'm talking about, I have a couple of maps up here that I'll talk about in a moment, but they're hard to interpret on a TV screen. They're hard for me to read from standing right here looking at them, but the colors give you some indication of what might be happening. We'll talk about them in a moment, but you can go to our website at www.fbcoem.org. The maps that I'll refer to, this one in particular, are all interactive maps. If you're worried about whether you're in a mandatory zone or a voluntary zone or no zone at all, simply find the appropriate map for the question you have and enter your address, and the map will bring up a dot where your property is located on the map on the screen. It's the easy way to identify what your status is. If you don't have that and you don't have access to a computer or a laptop or a newer iPhone, feel free to call us here at 281-342-6185, and we will get you an answer. You give us a number and we will have somebody call you back and tell you exactly where you are. Now, I've signed 2 orders this afternoon, and I want to get this data out because I have to talk about it. All right, let's talk about Barker Reservoir. We have, and it took longer than I'd hoped, but it's quite an engineering task. We have gotten the Barker Reservoir mandatory evacuation map down to a split. We have a mandatory evacuation zone, we have a voluntary evacuation zone, and then we have no zone at all where people are absolutely free to come and go. We believe there no longer is a threat. The map, I'm going to hold it up because this is the only example I have. It's on the website. The red is a mandatory zone. The orange is a voluntary zone in which there are no restrictions. We just say you need to watch it because there's water in your street. We've narrowed this map down to the areas that are mandatory, even the areas that are volunteer evacuations have water in the street, but we believe it's safe to traverse the streets to your property. The areas that are completely dry, to our knowledge, will be in no zone at all. They're being released by this order. I want to read out, if you'll bear with me, because I think it's important to those folks that have been sitting out there trying to get back in. I want them to know if they can. And again, we have to use by law the legal description, so this becomes confusing because people know these areas by the subdivision name. For instance, and I'll give you, for instance, we might have a ABC Ranch, sections 7 through 9, and really the subdivision name is Heavenly Acres. All right, they don't exist in Fort Bend County, but everybody knows that my home's in Heavenly Acres. That's why we urge you to use, if you don't know your legal description of the area that you live in, use the interactive map. It does. If you know your street address, it's going to tell you where you are. But remaining mandatory behind the Barker Reservoir is Canyon Gate, Cinco Ranch sections 1 through 8. Cinco at Willow Fork, Section 1, south of Camden Bend. Cinco Ranch Bioparks Estate, Section 1. Cinco Ranch Equestrian Village, Section 3. Cinco Ranch Greenway Village, Sections 10 through 12. Cinco Ranch Meadow Place, Section 5. Cinco Ranch North Lake Village, Section 13. Cinco Ranch South Park, Sections 1 and 3. Fairways at Kellywood, Section 1. Grand Lakes Phase 3, Section 7 through 11, lower areas in Section 8. Greens at Willow Fork, Section 1 and 2. Kellywood Court, Section 1. Kellywood Greens, Section 1 and 2. Kellywood Park. Legends at Cinco Ranch Apartments. Ricefield Village, Section 1. And Willow Fork, Section 1. These remain in the mandatory evacuation order under the mandatory evacuation order at this time. Subdivisions changing from mandatory to voluntary. And again, the voluntary really removes all restrictions and allows you to use your own best judgment. But I do point out there is water in your streets from Barker Reservoir. Cinco at Willow Fork, Section 1, north of Camden Bend. Cinco at Willow Fork, Section 2. Cinco Ranch, Cinco Forest, Sections 1 and 2. Cinco Ranch Fountain View, Section 3. Grand Lakes, Phase 2, Sections 1 through 6. Grand Lakes, Phase 3, Section 1 through 6. Grand Lakes, Phase 3, Section 8. Portions of that section are in the mandatory zone. And this is what added to the time in getting this done. We had to do it by elevation line, and it became very detailed in getting down here because we're carving up these sections. But again, that data is in the interactive map. So if you know your street address, it will do the math for you. Okay, Grand Lakes, Sections 3, 5, 8, 9, and 14. Kellywood Court, Section 1. Kellywood Link, Section 1. Willow Park Greens, Section 1. Those areas are now in a voluntary under a voluntary evacuation order. All right. Now to the big map here. We have been out working today since we're rapidly approaching the crest. There's no longer of the river. There's no longer the threat of overtopping or in-runs by the river on natural ground into these levee districts. We have been in consultation with the levee representatives, their engineer, their operator, and in some cases board members and attorney to discuss the status that they wish to have moving forward from this date. We have 3 criteria, as I said before. One, we need to be confident that the levee is sound. We're very confident that our levees are sound at 55. We think they're good up to 57 or 58. Our big concern was, were they any good at 59? That's gone by the wayside, thank goodness. And now we can talk about, are the streets clear? Is there water in the streets? And there is still rainwater in the streets and in the homes and behind some of these levees. It's not river water, it's rainwater that came in the deluge, and it takes time to get it pumped out because they can't use gravity flow to the river, obviously. So there are some changes made in our evacuation order status for levees. Districts changing from mandatory to voluntary evacuation. Again, voluntary evacuation removes restrictions and allows you to determine if you want to return. Fort Bend Levee Improvement District number 6, Fort Bend Levee Improvement District number 15, and Fort Bend Municipal Utility District number 21. Portions of districts, and the line does divide because the higher areas of some districts meet all the criteria. The lower areas still have water that has to be pumped out. So they're dividing lines. These are portions of districts changing from mandatory to voluntary evacuation. First Colony Levee Improvement District number 1, north of Highway 6. Fort Bend Levee Improvement District number 19, north of Hagerson Road. All right, those 2 areas are now voluntary evacuation areas. Portions of districts that will remain mandatory for the time being. First Colony Levee Improvement District number 1, south of Highway 6. And Fort Bend Levee Improvement District number 19, south of Hagerson Road. Districts remaining in mandatory evacuation. Fort Bend Levee Improvement District number 7, Fort Bend Levee Improvement District number 20, Sienna Plantation Levee Improvement District, Pecan Grove Municipal Utility District, Fort Bend Municipal District number 46, Fort Bend Municipal Utility District number 49, Fort Bend Municipal Utility District number 115, Palmer Plantation Municipal Utility District number 1, and Palmer Plantation Municipal District number 2. Districts remaining on volunteer evacuation status are Fort Bend Levee Improvement District number 2, Fort Bend Levee Improvement District number 10, Fort Bend Levee Improvement District number 11, Fort Bend Levee Improvement District number 14, Fort Bend Levee Improvement District number 17, and First Colony Levee Improvement District number 2. Those remain in a voluntary status, and probably the next action for them, we'll release all the order and they'll be considered to be open. But right now, under voluntary status, the only thing we're asking is exercise caution when you make the decision whether to stay or move around. With that, I think that concludes the information that we wanted to get out as quickly as we could. I'll be happy to answer any questions that anybody has. Yes, sir.
Can you talk to us about the Stavanoa Bridge? What's going on there?
The Stavanoa Bridge is closed. It's closed because the water is at a height that does not allow us to observe the activity of that river on the pier, on the new pilings that we've set in, or on the dirt supporting the end of the bridge, the abutment supporting the bridge. Since we can't see what's happening, and since we know a relatively small amount of further erosion could cause a collapse, it will stay closed until the water recedes to the point we have laser reflectors on critical components. And we have those measurements. We know exactly where they need to be. As soon as those reflectors clear, they will be out there with their laser levels, and they will check those elevations. They will check for movement. If there's any movement at all, you can just plan on it being closed for up to 2 years while we replace the bridge or that portion of the bridge. We don't know. I can't tell you what the odds are. The river's doing what the river wants to do, and we will know what it's done there as soon as the water gets down. I can't tell you exactly what level, but if you're in, that we could put the laser back on it, but if you'd like that information, I'm sure we can come up with it and get it to you. But obviously at 55 plus, we can't see what's going on there. And it very well may be that that bridge goes in the river during this flood. It moved a significant amount of dirt away from that pier in the last 2 floods, but remember, this is our 4th major flood in 3 years, all acting on that bridge. It's an accumulation of damage. The Toll Road Authority, Fort Bend Toll Road Authority, had actually decided to make those repairs on their own and seek reimbursement later rather than apply for federal funds in order to try and get ahead of the next storm. Obviously, they didn't get there. The amount of work that was done on that contract, we know won't offer any protection to the river. There weren't enough pilings in place to offer protection. So we'll wait and see. I think, I'm hoping for the best, but I certainly can't tell you what the outcome would be.
Hey Judge, can we talk about Barker Reservoir? The Harris County Flood Control District said that they did not expect any new flooding, and overnight an alert went out to people living over there saying that the reservoir had risen to 101.1 feet at this time, and imminent flooding is expected in this area. That use of words sent a panic.
I understand that, and I apologize for that. That went out from our Joint Information Center, and they're using the bureaucratic language that has to be in the declaration of an emergency. It was there in the original order, and they just used it again and sent it out. I was not aware that was happening. We won't be using those terms. They now understand that we have to use them in the initial order, but when we modify an order, we need to communicate the real world facts that are causing us to modify the order. I know it caused a lot of confusion out there, and I do apologize to those folks that were put out and had to do things they normally would not have to do because of the panic that words like that can create. When somebody tells me I'm in danger of an imminent flood, I think Jonestown, and I want to leave, okay? Never was an event like that. That's why we can get into the water a little bit to let people come back in, because even if they have a mechanical problem at the dam and they have to stop discharging, the water's going to come up, it will come back up at some rate, but it will be a slow enough rate. We'll see the rise, and there'll be plenty of time to get those folks out. where we are now, because when we see water rising up to the curb, we know it's time to tell them to leave. It's going the wrong way. So that was, I think, an over-eager attempt to expedite the getting the declaration out. They used the wording off the shelf, and it was totally inappropriate.
Judge, the other concern out there was you had posted on social media that those in the mandatory evacuation zones, if you leave, even to get groceries, we cannot let you back, law enforcement cannot let you back in. Can you tell people that are in those areas, what's the process going to be like? Will there be deputies, officers stationed out there, or are they going to have to show ID? When you say law enforcement cannot let you back in, what is the process?
Well, unfortunately, that's the way the law works. It doesn't allow us a lot of discretion. We have a voluntary, I can order a voluntary evacuation. That doesn't even require a signed order. I can just declare a voluntary evacuation. And what that means is you ought to get out of there, but you can do what you want to do. When I go to a mandatory evacuation, whatever boundaries are established in that mandatory evacuation become an act of, an official act of the law itself. It's an executive order that has the weight of law during the emergency, and it gives police powers to the officers that are out there. The problem is they don't have much discretion. They have to make sure that if somebody tries to get into the area, they don't. It's under a mandatory evacuation. They can't parse the word and say, well, you know, you can go in there 300 yards because that's probably not too bad. It's a mandatory evacuation, and they must enforce that. There's no intermediate step. If there were an intermediate step under the law, we would have taken it. We never felt there was a significant risk to additional property from the rising water, because we knew when we issued the order that the water level was holding firm, and the Corps had increased their discharge. What we were trying to do, and now in hindsight, I can see a couple of things we may have been able to do, but we acted quickly because we felt people were abusing the voluntary evacuation order in those areas that were significantly inundated with water up to 5-6 feet in their homes. And when you have people jet skiing through the area, when you have them boating with small children in a boat like they're out on Lake Conroe, you create a situation where folks can get hurt. A small boat hits a fire hydrant that's submerged, they didn't see coming, turns over, now you have victims. We wanted to avoid victims. We took the most expeditious action we could take, given all the other issues we were working with, to give our law enforcement people police powers. We thought we could ramp it down overnight to a much smaller area. The problem we ran into is the legal intricacies and the engineering intricacies of doing that. It's a lot easier to declare it over. It's a lot easier to issue a mandatory order for a levee district or a water district or a city or an entire county, because you have known boundaries. There are no boundaries. This is a portion, a relatively small portion of a very large area. Now, everybody calls Seco Ranch, but it's numerous different developments. We had to carve out the area, and that required a lot of work. We had to have exhibits we could deliver to the law enforcement personnel, etc. The way we expedited the call inconvenienced a lot of people, but it got those police powers in the hands of the law officers that had the problem where the water was deep. But then had we tried to carve it out, we would have spent hours carving it out. We then tried to carve it out so we could give relief to the folks sitting in dry land, but that took hours. 1 o'clock today at a meeting of the court, I told everybody, we had several dozen people on the phone. We had a call-in hookup set up. We had several dozen people on the phone, and I told them that I hope to have the order out before 3 o'clock. That was a hope. I didn't know if we could do it. We'd been working on it for some time at that moment. I signed the order about 10 minutes after 6. It had finally been through engineering, it had finally been through legal, and it came up to the point where it was something we could send and know full well it was something that our law enforcement people could enforce, that it had all the dry land out, that we didn't have too much of the wet, inundated properties in. And now I think this one will relieve a lot of people. There'll still be some folks. Judgments have to be made. We use the rule of 2 inches of water standing in the street. If you got 2 inches, you're in the voluntary zone. And if you have more than 2 inches, you're in the mandatory zone, because you get over 2 inches, at any speed, hydroplaning becomes a real problem, just driving, so it becomes dangerous to drive the street. It's arbitrary. Could we have done 3 inches? Perhaps. But we've at least got it down to where everybody who's in the mandatory zone can see water out their front door. All right? And that's a good thing. And I apologize it took so long, but we have to create some of these actions on the run, if you will, and respond to needs. I see now that I probably should have taken the time, but then there's another part of me said, well, if you'd have taken another 3 hours to let the police out of the fire, somebody might have got hurt. Was it worth taking that risk? I think I would come down and I would do it different in getting the size of the area shrunk quicker, because now I know there are a few shortcuts we can take. Now you can always speed up a process once you've been through it. But I think I would have done the same thing to get those police powers where they needed to be. But it was never targeted at the dry land. They were innocent victims of the need to solve a serious problem in a portion of the area that was underwater. Okay? Any other questions? I'll take one more if you got it. Yes, sir.
Talk to us about deaths. How many deaths in the county?
We've had 2.
And can you give us the details of that? You know?
Yes, sir. Unfortunately, yesterday we had a couple out in the Fulshire area that turned off FM 1093 north on a road just across the street from the village of Weston Lakes. I think they had been down that road many times before, and they'd probably been down that road. That road is bordered by Bessie's Creek, which floods in heavy rains. It's got a reputation for the water getting high when nobody else has high water. But they knew the area and they knew the water. I don't think they could see the water. I don't think they would have entered that water unless they had confidence they'd been there before. This was a different flood, though. There was a current in Bessie's Creek because of the intense rains. And while the water may have looked safe, they got about 1,000 yards out when their tires lost traction and the current took them over and inverted the vehicle. Our units responded very quickly. I believe the chief at Fulshire Fire Department made the response and was fortunate enough to find a rescue team from the state of Arizona that had come to Fort Bend County, and they just put gas in their truck at the corner of 359 and 1093. And he asked for them to follow him, and they got there in just a few minutes. And the gentleman, whose name I don't really have in front of me, but he needs to be commended for his efforts, went into that water himself and with assistance from the team extracted those folks very quickly. So they were out in a period of minutes, but a period of minutes is too long when you're in a flooded car. They were lost.
Did someone see this happen? They witnessed it?
I don't know that anybody witnessed. I'm not aware of that. I do know that the lady in the car did call 911 and advised that where she was and that they were in the car, in the water, and they could not get the doors open and they could not swim. Those are the messages that have come to me. Other than that, I have no more facts.
You don't know what kind of vehicle they were driving?
No, sir, I do not. Okay. Any other questions? All right. Let's everybody out there stay safe. Remember, and I'm going to close it again with what I always say, we can replace the property, but we can't replace the lives. Let's not lose any more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judge.
Thank you. Thank you. Good questions.